Hello, this is Evil O, and today I am speaking with Pankaj Kehr. Pankaj, how would you like to describe yourself? I know you as a collector, but how would you describe yourself?
Well, I think in the context of this conversation, I would like to sort of maybe say that in order to understand things, I like to look at the history of things. Whether it's the history of nations or people or even words and ideas. Um,
You're very well versed in history and you're rather philosophical. So
yeah, and so that pretty much covers who I am. Thank
and
you.
I just wanted to say that, normally my channel talks exclusively about art.
Yeah,
But I feel that when you talk about art, you have to also talk about such things as ethics, politics to some extent, because all this stuff is brought into art. So what actually initiated our conversation and why we decided to do this was a post I made on Facebook, which got quite a few responses. And what I had posted on Facebook was, agree with us or you have no heart. Agree with us or you have no brain. Agree with us or you fail to recognize your privilege. Hashtag left wing tactics. But I could easily do the same thing with the right wing, in terms of nationalism, patriotism. Agree with us or you are not patriotic. So my issue is not so much a left right issue, but it's more of a why are arguments being framed in this way, in which it is presumed that if you do not agree with the person who holds a particular ideology, you are somehow a bad person. Okay.
yeah.
So I'll just leave it there and let you kind of say a few words what you thought of that post or any comments you have.
Well, my response to your post was that, um, and of course, reading everybody else who had posted was, I saw it in terms of human interaction and dynamics. This is how we control people, right? This is how we blame and shame people, and so it wasn't really about politics for me. It was about someone with a particular political leaning using shaming and blaming kind of language to get someone else to agree with them,
It's
right?
a psychological technique, isn't it?
That's
It's
right.
more of a psychological technique.
Right.
You set
Right.
a parameter and you say, well, if you do not agree with this, then you're not patriotic. You're not a good Indian. You're not a good American, whatever the case might be. Or
That's
agree with this, or else you're not human and you don't emphasize with the suffering of others.
right. Yeah. I was looking somewhere and it said that um, whilst chastity as a virtue is the most unfashionable virtue, compassion is now the most passionate or virtuous virtue. you know and I think that pretty much sort of gave me a sense of the um, why it's fashionable to be compassionate,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and so that's again how it is. Are you as hip as I am? you
Are you
know
as compassionate as I am? And there's something troublesome when compassion becomes fashionable.
that's right.
Because there's a lack of sincerity to it. It's virtue signaling, and I know that term is used too much.
Mhm.
But what you just said about how things change, and I remember going way back to the 1970s, I had a friend who was, of all things, an Orthodox priest, believe it or not. And he told me one time, what did he say? He said, 20 years ago, everybody would be ashamed to tell you about their masturbatorial habits, but everybody would be perfectly comfortable telling you about their spirituality or their habits in prayer. And now, and this was in the late 60s or early 70s, he said, now everybody's ashamed to talk about their spirituality or their prayer, but everybody will tell you about their masturbation.
Mm.
And that's how times changed, at least in the US.
Yeah, so maybe this fashion to be compassionate is a form of of spirituality.
Right,
I mean, after all, at the end of the day, the word compassionate is one of the seven virtues in Christianity, right?
right.
And in fact, compassionate is one of the virtues that is recognized as a virtue in almost all religions.
Right.
And in Hinduism, there are shades of compassion. You know, there's pity and compassion for others, and there's even then compassion for all living beings. You know, so there's even this sort of gradient of compassion, right? And then in Christian discussions, there's always been this debate between pity and compassion.
And there's a great difference between pity and compassion, because you can have pity and not have absolutely no compassion. Actually, you only have pity.
Right.
I tend to agree with more the Hindu perception of things, because I see most things of being as being on a gradient. I don't see things as being black and white, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Well, even among Christian sciences, I mean, there's altruism versus compassion, right?
Right.
And then I was looking, one of my favorite words actually is enlightened self-interest. And I was, before I came on today with you, I was thinking about what the difference between enlightened self-interest might be and compassion, you know.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, they're shades. But coming back to what you said earlier, I do believe that whilst it may be embarrassing for people to talk about spirituality in an open kind of way, they will speak about their spirituality in terms of virtues, and compassionate being the most
There's,
fashionable virtue.
there's a lot of theory now that, for lack of a better term, social justice activism has become a sort of new religion,
That's,
and the virtual signaling. What I often find, and people always say, well, you don't win a Facebook argument. Nobody ever wins a Facebook argument, because you never change somebody's mind. And then when I see people who are constantly posting about one thing or another, um, always complaining about this or that, I won't get into the particulars. You realize after a while that they're not really trying to convince anybody. What they're doing is signaling that they're part of the herd, and that don't leave the herd, because if you leave the herd, then I'm not with you. You understand? That's actually what they're doing. They're not trying to convince you. I mean, I don't think anybody who's ranting about Modi or ranting about Trump is changing minds, or making fun of Rahul, as Papu. It's not changing anybody's minds, but they're signaling an in-group that they are a part of, and they're letting you know that you need to conform, otherwise you will not be part of their group.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very troublesome when on one occasion, if I had something not so positive to say about Mr. Modi, but on another day I thought, hey, I think what he just did was pretty good. And
Right.
very confusing for people, because I mean, I'm now a traitor. Within one day I've just sort of left the herd. And so there's no balance either.
Right. There's no differentiating of shades. You're either on this side or you're on that side. And people don't allow for people to be in between. And I mean, I was in Bangkok, and our friends from Amsterdam were visiting,
Mhm.
Patrick and Mariska, who are collectors. They're wonderful people. And Patrick's a bit of a businessman. He's a collector, but he's a little hard-nosed businessman also. And he ventured over a dinner that we had. He said that actually he thought Trump had done some very good things when it came to the trade deals with China, and he was doing the proper things. And I had to warn him. I said, well, don't say that in front of this person, and that person, because they will totally fly off the handle, because anything you say good about Trump, they will just start ranting. And that's unfortunately that we live in this world where you cannot talk about policy that is because policy is so connected to the personality and everybody hates the personality.
That's right.
So you can't separate the policy sometimes. Um, you had commented on that post. You had said something about nationalism, I remember. I forget exactly what you said.
Yes, I said, either you agree with us or you're a dirty nationalist,
Yes, yes.
And what had happened was I had interacted with a friend of mine who on what was it, April 14th, which is the day that the Jallianwala massacre had happened, had said that, well, it was the Indians who fired. They were the ones who fired the bullets. So why should the British apologize?
Okay.
Well, for one thing, I thought it was insensitive to post that on April 14th. All right. But more so than that, I felt that it was more mischievous. And rather than having a deep knowledge of the facts of Jallianwala Bagh, one of which is that the soldiers actually fired into the air first to warn them. And it was Dyer who said that, look, if why have I brought you here? You need to shoot low.
Right.
And secondly, my other issue with this person was that he is the son of a general in the Indian Army, going all the way back to the Second World War. And I was trying to explain to him, I said, don't you know that a soldier is trained to obey orders, even if he dislikes it?
Yes.
And
That's
so
the nature of the military. You're trained to obey orders.
that's right.
Because if you're not trained to obey orders, you can't win on the battlefield.
That's right. And so my real issue with the whole conversation with him was that rather than talking about the historical facts, which is what I wanted to enter into, I just got told, hey, you're a dirty nationalist, blah, blah, blah. And so now it's a personal thing.
Right.
I'm being attacked. Uh, you know, I'm the messenger, right? I mean, you can
Right.
disagree with the message, but hey, anyway, we worked it out to the extent that we haven't left each other.
Well, everybody so quickly these days, and sometimes I'm guilty of it myself, I hate to say it, but everybody so quickly degenerates into this, well, you're a fascist, you're a racist, you're a commie, you know, you're a commie, because I've used that on occasion, you're just a commie. But I generally do it I mean, not half-heartedly, but jokingly, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the direction that dialogues go, and it's so sad. It's like, well, you're never going to meet in the middle anywhere that way, or you're never really going to understand each other if you demonize the other person immediately.
Yeah, and that's what it is, right? I mean, this whole, I mean, you read it in the papers, you hear from people saying that, the whole art of conversation and debate and discussion and disagreement, respectfully disagreeing, is being lost,
Right.
And so if that's the case, there's no way we're going to have a discussion about the shades of compassion.
And listening to the other side is, to me, part of being compassionate. If you're compassionate, you're willing to give the other person a chance to explain themselves and still treat them as a human being. So, I mean, now I'll get political a little, but because I had a journalism minor in college. And so I'm very conscious of the media and how the media treats people these days. And I'm just often very shocked with the way the media, behaves. But I remember when Trump won election in 2016, of course, everybody thought it was going to be Hillary because she was riding high in the polls, and so did I. I went to sleep, and I had endorsed Hillary on Facebook. I'd endorsed Hillary Clinton because I didn't think that Trump was up for the job. And I woke up expecting to find out that we would have Madam President, as did everybody else. And here it was, Trump had won rather magically. Well, it's almost an American tradition that a couple of weeks after the election, the president-to-be will appear on a late night television show, you know, with one of the late night comedians, and there will be some joking back and forth. I think Obama appeared on Saturday Night Live or something and played saxophone, and, you know, but it's always that, it's sort of the ritual of bringing people together again after the election, that, okay, here he is, he's in front of a live audience, we're all gonna laugh and tell jokes, and now things are, you know, let's start coming together. Well, Trump appeared on Jimmy Kimmel, who treated him quite well. And Jimmy Kimmel at one point reached over and said, "Can I rub your hair? Is that a wig? Can I rub it?" And Trump said, "Sure, you can rub it." So Jimmy Kimmel reached over and rubbed Trump's hair. And Twitter and the left-wing media just tore Kimmel apart the next day and ranted and raved, really, and said Kimmel had humanized Trump and he should never have humanized him. And in all my life following politics in the US, I had never heard such a thing before. And that wasn't compassionate.
Yeah, yeah. And actually this kind of a dynamic, which is the way I like to call it, is very similar to the, you know, the questions that you put on your post about if you agree with me, or if you disagree with me, you know, because to me what happens in there is I'm seeing what is known as the victim triangle, right? So you have the left, which is the victim, right? You have Trump, the persecutor,
Right.
and Jimmy Kimmel, who's the rescuer, and he's just rescued Trump.
Right. He made an attempt to rescue Trump,
yeah,
and humanize him.
That's right. By humanizing him, he has rescued him.
Right.
You know, and that's the triangle that we've just got ourselves into, right? And so now the victim turns the persecutor, and they persecute Jimmy.
Yes.
And that's the dynamic that we often see.
And nobody has ever dared have Trump on a show again, you know, during the presidency, nor have they had, I don't believe they've ever had his wife on either anywhere. I mean, she's also become taboo and tainted in some way, which I find also very strange, because many times first ladies are always given sort of this special, you know, they're okay. You can treat the first lady respectfully, even if you disagree with the president, but not in this case.
Yeah, that's because, you know, he doesn't need anyone to validate him. He validates himself.
Right.
He just.
So anyway, let's get back to compassion. So, okay. So a wild animal, you find a small baby wild animal in your backyard. Is it compassionate to feed the animal? Or is it more compassionate not to feed the animal? I mean, this is just sort of an ethical thing, I think.
Well, I was just remembering my son. When he was young, he found this little bird that had fallen out of a nest in our backyard.
Right.
And he tried, he woke me up late at night, and he tried to, you know, revive this little bird. And you know, we told him it's not going to survive. They never do, you know. But he tried taking care of him, you know, made a little nest with cotton balls and stuff like that. And I mean, you know, what do you do, right? I don't know what the real, I mean, why would I not feed them, right? If that, it's like, I don't know, did you see 2 years ago, there was a drought, and I saw videos of a monkey trying to drink water out of a tap, but it wasn't one of those taps that you could turn. You had to press the button, you know, that little button.
Okay.
And there was this village woman who was pressing the button on the tap whilst the monkey drank water.
Right.
And then in this video, I don't know if it was doctored, but the video, when the monkey had its fill, reaches out and puts his arm around the woman.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that is very interesting in social media, because it's really changed my thinking.
Yeah.
I studied biology when I was really young, like in high school. I was into biology and ecology and all that. That's why I still have a strong ecological bent.
Mm.
But I guess social media has made me realize that animals are so much more sentient and so much more complex than I ever imagined, because it was always drilled into our heads to not anthropomorphize the animals. You know, you have to view them through a scientific lens.
Mhm.
And more I realize how wrong that is in many ways, because many animals simply, you know, it becomes obvious that they have emotions. It's obvious that you can now observe them in so many videos that individuals take, sharing food, helping each other, traveling together, even when they're different species.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, our attitudes have changed. And so thus we maybe become more compassionate towards animals because of that.
Well,
Um,
the concept of compassion for animals is, at least in India, has always existed.
right,
And one of it occurred to me today that the Jain wears a face mask because he doesn't want to hurt even a flying insect that might get into his mouth and die.
right,
Okay. And in fact, when I was thinking about the difference between enlightened self-interest and compassion, this was the example that came up for me, is that I wear a mask today during the corona, during this lockdown, because I have an enlightened self-interest in keeping my community disease-free.
right,
Not because I necessarily, feel a great amount of compassion for my neighbor, right? I don't want him to give it to me, and I don't want to give it to him. And
right,
so, to wear a mask, there's a self-interest in all of us respecting this law, right?
right.
But that's not necessarily compassion. Compassion to me is when the Jain monk wears his face mask because he says, I don't want to hurt even the smallest of living creatures.
Right. Well, we were talking the other day about the difference between an emotional compassion and a logical compassion. And I forget the examples we were talking about. Maybe you'll remember. Um, Sort of like, oh, I know. I was going back to the US in the 1960s when it was decided that we needed to have welfare
Mhm.
for poor black families, mostly black, white families, also Hispanic, whatever. But, you know, it was basically developed for the black community during the civil rights, the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And it was designed that if you had a single mother, she got, you know, some assistance for living. And if she had one child, then she got a little bit more assistance for living. And if she had two children, she got more, and three children, she got more. So basically, the more kids she had, the more assistance she got from the government.
Right.
And this was done purely out of good heartedness. It was done through good intentions, I'm sure. It was not an evil conspiracy, it was done through good intentions. But the effect of it was it encouraged many black households to split up, where the man of the house decided it was to everybody's advantage if he wasn't there, because his wife would get more money, and he would just drop in once in a while, and he didn't want to get caught by the social workers. Didn't want to get caught by the social workers that there was still a man in the household. So now you have this incredible statistic that 70% of young children in black communities in America are growing up without fathers. They're growing up in single person households, which I find just tragic. And to me, it illustrates that whole thing about the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And
So,
so, you know, to me, that's the difference between a feeling heartfelt compassion, oh, we have to do this for these people to help them, and a more logical compassion that says, maybe we want to help them, but maybe this is not the way to do it.
mhm, mhm.
Did you understand?
Oh, totally, totally, totally. I mean, again, I sometimes I see these things in the victim triangle kind of way. You have now a situation where someone thinks that it's a good idea to give someone dole, welfare, right?
Right.
You then create it, and that person who's receiving that welfare is the victim.
Right.
And you might have the father who's perhaps made as being the persecutor. He left, he abandoned them, right?
Right.
And then, but as you said, I mean, if you have, you have now a situation where in a society, 70% are growing up in a family where there's an absent father. You've created more problems, right?
And it's up to 30% in the white community in
Right.
America. 30% of the white community is also now single parent households. And I think that is a horrible effect on young children growing up.
Oh, totally. I mean, that's at the heart of what it means to be a codependent. It's at the core of all drug addictions or any kind of addictions, not just drug addiction.
Getting
Uh,
involved in gangs, getting involved in violence,
that's right. Yeah.
not performing well at school, low self-esteem. So many of those things can be traced to not having a
Absolutely.
father or not having a mother in the home.
That's right. That's right.
Uh-huh.
Um, not that by having to, I mean, you could have a situation where the father and the mother are still together, but they're constantly fighting, and it's violent at home, whether physically or verbally violent. I mean, even that's not a good situation, right? And so there's a lot of discussion as to whether it's more compassionate for the parents who don't get along well with each other to separate themselves. Um,
Well, that was always the argument for divorce back in the days that divorce was so stigmatized. People basically did not get divorced. I mean, that's the way it was when I was a kid. I grew up in a time when people got divorced, it was considered really shameful. You know, it
yeah,
was really shameful. Oh my God, they're getting divorced. What about the children? Blah, blah, blah. But the argument was made it's better if they separate rather than stay together and the kids grow up in this household where the parents are fighting all the time and obviously hate each other. Now, there certainly is some truth to that, and I certainly supported that idea for a long time. But I think also it maybe has gone to the other end now where people separate simply when the sex is no longer so fun. You know, you find sex with somebody else somewhere else that's better. And so, okay, let's get a divorce because I'm going to go run off with this woman or man. It is problematic, you know.
well, you know what you just said. I was going back and looking at the etymology of the word compassion.
Okay, tell me.
Yeah, in it, the word comes from com and pati,
Okay,
and so com as in together or two, and the word pati leads to the word patience.
okay,
It also leads to the word patient. But it also leads, and this is the one that I like the most, was that the word compatible actually comes from the word compassion,
yeah,
right? And
right,
so when I thought about this word, I said, how is compatible and compassion linked? I thought in terms of, exactly what you're talking about, which is in terms of marriage, that uh, it is through compassion for each other that you become compatible with each other.
yes, you learn to tolerate each other's differences.
That's right. And I mean, and isn't that what the marriage vows were all about, right? In
Right.
suffering and in health and wealth and whatever, right? I mean, and that's at the core of that relationship, is this ability to support you in your times of suffering.
Well, yeah, people, this is maybe a divergence, but people ask me all the time, how can I consider myself to still have a partner, Thomas, even though Thomas lives in Bangkok and I live in Udaipur for most of the year? And it's like, well, number one, we've been together for 30 years, but also it's a matter of as the relationship has evolved, we've become more and more compatible, compassionate, and that an understanding developed that we're reacting to our old age differently. So Tommy wants to be in a very shanti, totally retired, no agenda headspace because he doesn't want stress, which I can understand because he's had health problems. And so I have to accept that and leave him do that. And he understands that as I've gotten older, I've gotten more passionate about getting things done before I die. So I'm in a very different headspace in wanting to do a lot and have a lot of agenda. That's not necessarily real compatible when we're in the same space. So we give each other room, but the love hasn't broken down. There's still a lot of compassion and trust among each other, and we still talk to each other every day, you know?
And one of the measures, one of the um, true measures of compassion has always been about love. You know, that in the action that you call compassion, I can measure if it is true compassion, or if I can see if there's a measure of love in it.
Right.
The word compassion and love have always been, have always been a part of the same concept.
So I'm going to bring it back to art a little bit.
Okay.
Though I do want to get back to some of the things we were talking to about parenting also. But I was just, another post I made several years ago, people jumped on me on just because I asked a question. And I said, is there ever a point where an artist, a young artist, needs to be told, maybe you just really shouldn't be an artist? More or less, when you've gone through school, you're 28 years old, you still don't seem to have an ability to draw, to paint by any means. You are very weak on conceptualizing anything. You can't articulate what you're doing. You don't seem to have the real energy and drive to see yourself as an entrepreneur who's really going to push your art forward in some way. Is the compassionate thing to do, rather than keep feeding their dreams and saying, oh, just hang in there, keep going, you know, it's a long road, you're going to make it someday? Or is it more compassionate to say, you know, maybe you should have listened to your father and maybe you should have went into dentistry or something like that?
Yeah.
And I got torn apart for even asking that question. But to me, it is a question. It's like, what is the compassionate response? Sometimes it might not be compassionate to keep encouraging somebody to do something they're not good at.
I think so, because I think it's also dishonest by omission, by not telling them that, look, I really think you're not cut out for this. I mean, so it's another form of dishonesty, right? So it really depends on the quality of my relationship with that person. Is there in that relationship an expectation for my honesty?
Right.
And if it is then I do have some responsibility to speak up and say, look.
But in the music world, in the world of music training, they're much more heartless and blunt about telling people and saying, well, look, you're never going to be a tenor. Just forget it. Your voice is not a tenor's voice. You're never going to do it. You're never going to be a great pianist because your fingers are too fat and your knuckles rub together. They're not made for playing the piano. You should maybe think of playing the drums or something else that you would be better suited for. So in music, they will come right out and be very blunt about it sometimes. But I find in visual arts, there's always this sense that goes back to, when the young kids, when they're children and they first pick up the paintbrushes in grade school, it's always encourage them, don't discourage them, encourage them. Well, at what point do you stop encouraging?
Well, maybe that can be directed in some way. I mean, look, maybe you're not going to be Picasso, but maybe you can be a great art director, or you can,
right.
Look at, channelize that in some other way, there's passion. I mean, my father, he once, when I was 16 at lunch, over lunch, he asked me, so what do you want to be? And mind you, he'd asked me that several times. over the years, and every time I said something, he told me that was a bad idea. So when I was 16, he asked me that question, and I said, well, and I'd been seeing a lot of French art movies, black and whites, right? And I suddenly had this vision of myself on the left bank in Paris, struggling to make art movies, right? I mean, the whole idea of just being in Paris at that time, at that age, was the most wonderful idea I ever had.
Oh, I wanted to talk about an art movie, actually. It was sort of on my mental list. I want to talk about Moonlight. Remember Moonlight? It won Best Picture about 3 years ago, I think.
Okay. Oh
And I
no, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen
didn't
it.
see it. Okay, well, I saw it, and it got so many raves and praise and blah blah blah. And I went to see it. It's basically about a young black gay boy growing up in the ghetto,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
how he's bullied in school, and how he has to suffer with his drug addicted mother, who has some mental problems and ends up in an institution. And it's basically a gay finding himself story. Um, I honestly didn't like it, and I failed to develop any sympathy for the kid. And even though I myself was bullied in school, I was bullied a whole lot, so I know what bullying is all about because I suffered it all through junior high and most of high school. But this kid is, as portrayed in the film, was such a wimp and never, just sort of quiet and pouting and never stood up to anybody, that, I mean, in the middle of the movie, I was like, well, God, I'm ready to get up and hit this kid in the face until he stands up for himself. And then it had the most weak, depressing ending, in that at the very end, he finds his childhood crush, who's working like in some greasy spoon restaurant as a cook. And he's become sort of a pseudo gangster with the gold chains and all that. And he's finally learned to be tough. He's finally learned to be tough and fit in. And he finds this guy, and they go off together, and it's insinuated they're going to have sex, and that's kind of the end of the movie. And it was such a and I do like art films, but it left me totally cold. And then in that same year, you had a film that was called Hidden Figures, which, did you see Hidden Figures? I thought that was an incredible film. And it was based on a true story. I mean, it was a true story. Hidden Figures was a true story. And it took place in the 1960s under the Kennedy administration, when NASA was first coming together. And they didn't have computers yet. They didn't have computers, so they had teams of women literally in the basement doing these huge calculations and algorithms and everything, so they could figure out how to get these rockets up into the orbit and come back where they wanted to be. And a lot of these women were black.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
they
know,
were
I know
black
that.
mathematicians. And the movie traces their story, and this is in the Jim Crow South, so they have to, suffer, indignities, like having to leave their office space and walk halfway across NASA to find the toilet that's marked for the colored people, which was horrible. And then there's a catharsis in the middle, where the director of the Space Administration, knocks down those signs and says there's no segregation in NASA, and blah, blah, blah. But to me, that movie was so uplifting. It showed people who were determined, and, they were suffering, but they didn't really see themselves as victims. They were just hard workers who, were fighting the system. They were activists. They were fighting. They wanted the system to change, and they were making huge contributions. But unlike Moonlight, they were not wallowing in self-pity. And to me, that was by far the better movie, in my estimation. Now, maybe that's my white,
No,
take,
no,
but
no, no. I think the clue is there in what you just shared, because it's about victimhood,
yeah,
and so here you have these women not willing to be victims, not living their life through a state of victimhood,
right.
Whereas you have this other guy who's basically a victim. He may toughen up, but he then is looking for this rescuer who's his, childhood lover,
Right.
you know, that's how it reads to me,
I know.
and this, I think this dynamic, it's something I came across many years ago. And one of the guys who wrote a book about the drama triangle, by the way, he calls it the drama triangle, victimhood. He says this is the only game in town. That's that's how he described it in the opening to the book. Everyone is in this process of being a victim. Because the victim gets to control, the victim always wins.
Yeah.
You know, and and I think that's I tend to understand many things through that paradigm.
You had some strong thoughts. I wanted to pick your head a little bit. You had some strong thoughts on parenting and fatherhood. I know when I was with you the other day when I was in Delhi before we both got locked down, you talked about taking your son to the tailor to pick out a suit. And you said that was a real bonding experience. It was sort of a father-son thing. And then the other day on Facebook, it seemed like you had your son out at the racetrack or something like that, if I
That was
read
last
that
year.
right.
I was last year in Las Vegas.
So talk about parenting as a father, maybe. And
Well,
why is it necessary for a son to, or a young boy growing up to have a father rather than to be growing up in a single household?
uh, I don't know if I can. I know what I want to say. I just don't know if I'm ready to talk about it right now. But so I will speak about it in a limited kind of way. Um, it's this whole thing about going to the tailor. That why that was significant for me was that um, in civilizations, in communities, say in Africa or in India or anywhere in the world, there's always been a coming of age ritual, right? I mean, you might have a father and a son who go into the jungles of Africa. They wait all night, um, and or he's sent in the jungle, and he just has to grow up. You know, maybe
Yeah.
he makes his first kill, and it brings it back, and all of that, right? This coming of age is very important. Um, I remember when I was 17, 18, and I was my we I had decided that I was going to go and study in Germany, um, but I was also very scared about the idea of leaving India and leaving my home and going to a foreign country. I didn't speak German at that time, so I was fearful, and I needed a father who at that time could be sensitive to that fear, right? And also then encourage me how to deal with it.
All right.
And that to me is the process of coming of age, right? That's the experience that I have to go. The fear, the fear of going to a foreign country, or the fear of staying overnight in a jungle,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why that passage is so important, right? Now, in modern day terms, we don't have that.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, a ritual that existed between a father and a son has been lost, right? But if I look, there are many passages that in modern urban living can still provide you. You know, for example, going to a three-star Michelin restaurant where everyone looks at you as if you shouldn't be in there.
Right.
You don't belong here. And so it's fearful. And or in this case, we went to a suit store in New York, and I was with him to help him choose a suit, you know, and he didn't know enough about suits, and he didn't want to be. He was afraid that he was going to look like a fool.
Right.
Okay,
It's
And
like buying your first computer if you don't know anything about
yeah,
computers.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. It's the fear that's there.
Yeah.
And so and of course, having me as a father who knows a lot about suits, I mean, and I talked to him about a double vent versus a single vent and why I think structurally a double vented suit is better. I told him how high I think the cuff of his pants should be. I told him about how bespoke suits have a certain kind of uh, arm and the way it's stitched and how you can tell if it's all of that width of lapels and
How you can tell if it's off the rack or if it's been properly
yeah.
tailored. Right.
And so having taken him through that process, where he was being guided by someone who knew how to hunt for a suit,
Right.
that was why it was so significant.
And did you bag a suit in the end?
We did.
Oh, good.
And I offered to pay for it, and he wouldn't let me pay for it. And that was
Oh,
nice.
that's good. That's part of the growing experience for you too, then.
Well, and the growing experience in terms of childhood developmental needs, as they call it, is that he is separating himself from me. And in this case, the separation is financial.
Right.
This is my money. This is my suit. I'm responsible for paying for it.
Right.
And to have not to have insisted to pay for it would also have been to have in some way damaged that relationship or damaged him. I had to allow that thing to happen. That coming of age was more than just hunting for the suit, but also for paying for it.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, he and I have we have a very close relationship. We often talk on the phone. I mean, he lives in San Francisco, and he talks to me about his.
So I mean, the question you mean I want to answer this. So why can't a mother provide this for a son growing up? If you have a single mother, why can't she help her son go through some of these rituals? I'm playing devil's advocate because I'm sure some people would ask that question.
I think for the simple reason that typically it's not the mother who goes out to hunt for
No.
that wild boar or you know, and she certainly doesn't know enough about suits. Not because in any way she's less than the man, but simply because she has no need for a male suit.
Because generally she knows something much different and maybe knows more than the man perhaps, but it's on different topics in a different cultural area of expertise.
That's right. That's
Right.
all it is, really. And so you need that. A boy needs that.
Yeah.
And I mean, so my son went to a school in Gurgaon, and where up until he was in class 10, he had female teachers. And there was this one time in which he was at lunchtime, took an orange peel and he squeezed the juice of it on a friend's eye, and that friend complained, and the next thing he was being punished for having just squeezed a little bit of lemon on someone's eye, right? And as far as I'm concerned, from where I came from, it's just the kind of stuff boys do, right?
Right.
But in order to understand that, it would have been, if it had been a male teacher, it would have been processed differently.
Right. And people really dislike the expression boys will be boys these days.
Yeah.
But there's truth in that. And I think, like Jordan Peterson says, when boys are roughhousing, sometimes you have to let them do that because it's part of male growing up.
That's right.
It's part of establishing and learning how to deal with dominance hierarchies, how to defend yourself, and most of boys roughhousing is play. It's not like they're really trying to kill each other.
That's right.
Right. And even when I said I was bullied when I was a kid, but you grow up and you realize like a lot of those kids who bullied me I know exactly why they did now. I didn't at the time. And it wasn't just because I was gay. I mean, they bullied me because they came from low income families. They had fathers who were alcoholics. Their lives were really fucked, and I came
Right.
off as the privileged kids from the good family in the suburb, who was there to study and had all the answers to all the questions and got A's and blah, blah, blah. So of course I was a target because they were resentful.
Mm.
And so, in retrospect, you end up feeling sorry for them, and when you understand it.
Mm. Yeah.
But anyway, that's part of compassion too. Retrospective compassion. Sometimes that happens. You look backwards and somebody that you really disliked at one time, you suddenly realize, well, yeah, but now I understand. Now I feel, now I understand, you know?
Well, you were in pain at that time yourself, so it would have been hard to put yourself out of yourself and be in someone
Right,
else's shoe,
right, right.
which is
Exactly.
really what compassion is about,
Yeah,
is also, moving out of myself and moving into someone else's space,
right.
but also keeping myself separate, that's important.
So I think, we're probably running long enough that we should wrap it up, do you think? But
Okay.
I think that I don't want this to get too long because nobody will sit through the whole thing yet because, I'm not Jordan Peterson yet. But I basically feel like you really need to have that feeling compassion because that's the initial base that gets you going, and being a human being who can empathize with other people. But then you've got to have that logical compassion creep in there
Sure.
too, that sort of guides you and says, well, what's the logical, if I really feel horrible about this situation, then what's really the logical way to approach it rather than just the emotional way to approach it?
Right.
And like I was saying to you the other day, I still think of myself as a liberal, but as we were saying, like as time goes on, liberalism, the nature of liberalism is it's liberal, so it's for change, and so it keeps changing things, and eventually those of us who don't change with it or decide not to change with us, we become perceived as conservatives because we haven't kept up with that pace.
Right.
But I think there's a role for that because you need to have the older voices, because most of the time they're older, who say, okay, I understand your ideals, I understand what you want to accomplish, but think about it, because after 66 years of life, I kind of know that sometimes you might be going in the wrong direction and there might be a better way to solve these problems than what you think.
Right. Yeah.
Would you agree or no?
Oh, totally. I mean, again, you said something about about being human,
Yeah.
and in my own experience from in life has been that without having a sense of my own humanness, you know, I can't even begin to have compassion, true compassion for someone else,
Right.
you know, because it's only when I felt my own humanness, my limitations, my suffering, my struggles, uh, can I even begin to look at someone else's or feel someone else's,
Right.
you know? So I think it does begin with, maybe having compassion for myself to begin with, and then somehow that extends to others too.
You need a love of self before you can have a love of others also.
It's an age-old
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, would you say? I would say you need a love of self before you can muster up a love of others.
That's right. That's always been uh, the age-old truth. It hasn't changed.
Okay, Pankaj Kehr, nice talking to you. I'm
Thank
gonna I'm
you.
gonna say goodbye, but don't just click off right away. You have to tell me how to turn off this recorder.
You have to hit the stop button somewhere. It says recording. Where it
Yeah.
says recording, if you mouse over there, it probably gives you a pause or something.